But in South Massachusetts, that was right where this was. And there were a lot
My
of
dad
photos
used to, it got us started,
in fact,
he used to send them all the time. And then Ron started working on it. But came twice in a row, he got batches that he was in those strips. And he sent them back, so they took them back.
Oh, okay, all right, so we'll get
Kept them all, things, and he said,
It's running, so.
twice in a row.
I tend to walk around, how wide is the? Actually, I was focusing on smart. So they can hear my voice. That seems to be
Had a good deal. The Omaha State.
Yeah, otherwise it would be so far. I couldn't see the city.
No,
If someone, like it next door. I think so too, it's recording. So.
2000. We finally moved on.
Yeah.
2000.
It's good to see you today.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's about 21 minutes after the hour, and we got a lot of good stuff to cover this day. And I suspect that people will continue to file in as the lecture wears on.
How are you?
One thing I did want to point out is that on the schedule of classes, this was supposed to be the last class for the Sistine Chapel, Luther's reaction to the Sistine Chapel, or critique of the Sistine Chapel, but actually we're going to go one more week, so we will be back next week to finish this up. All right, before I get started, do any of you have any questions about what we've talked about, or just any thoughts on the Sistine Chapel, on Luther? Okay, well, all right. Just to bring you back around to where we are and where we're going, if you will remember, we have covered the first six panels, or first six frescoes that Michelangelo has painted. We started down here with the creation, the separation of light and darkness, and then God putting the creating earth, and then putting the sun and moon in the sky. Then we talked about God putting the firmament up there to divide the waters, the creation of Adam, and then we stopped right here with, we talked about the creation of Eve, and then we stopped with that sixth slide right there, in which Michelangelo depicted two scenes from the Bible. And one was the temptation of Adam and Eve, and then the second one was the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So I want to pick up with the expulsion from the Garden of Eden and give you some sense of what Luther would have thought about Michelangelo's treatment of that. But before I begin, let's take a look at the text that Michelangelo is working from. And this comes from Genesis chapter 3, verse 22. Then the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. This then is how Michelangelo conceptualized that. And again, we've got in this panel right here, we've got two different scenes going on. On the left-hand side, we have the temptation of Adam and Eve, which we talked about last week. And then on the right-hand side, you can see how Michelangelo has decided to depict the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. All right, so what would Luther have said about this had he come in and had he looked up there at that Sistine Chapel ceiling and gazed upon the portrayal of the expulsion? Well, Luther believed, and I'm working here from his commentary on Genesis, of course, Luther believed that the fall of Adam and Eve and their subsequent expulsion from the Garden of Eden was the most catastrophic event in the history of mankind. Prior to the fall, that is, the sin of Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, Luther believed all of Adam's and Eve's needs were taken care of without any effort on their part. Luther also believed that prior to the fall, Adam and Eve had possessed a will that was in perfect harmony with the will of God. Prior to the fall, he believed that Adam and Eve possessed a deep knowledge of all creation, and their reason was finally honed. That is, that they, at the time of creation, that God had imbued man and woman with a perfect knowledge of all things. Prior to the fall, Adam and Eve had beautiful bodies, bodies without any imperfection or blemish, No disease or old age had ravaged them. And then finally, prior to the fall, Luther argued that Adam and Eve lived a life of innocence. They had no knowledge of sin and had no shame or guilt. Luther believed that due to the sin of Adam and Eve, all of this was lost when God punished them and expelled them from the Garden of Eden. And because of this, because of his thoughts about what was lost at the time of the expulsion due to the sin of Adam and Eve, I think that Luther would have approved of Michelangelo's portrayal here of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Michelangelo has depicted the angel brandishing a sword to make sure that Adam and Eve never entered paradise again. Adam, if you look at Adam is showing great anxiety on his face as he thrusts up his hands, trying to ward off the punishment of God being carried out by the angel. And look at that arm that's stretching out there, right, trying to ward off the punishment. His right arm reaches out across the growing void, the space that now exists between God and mankind because of sin. Eve, look at that huddled figure of Eve. She's huddling down next to Adam in fear and dread. She looks back towards paradise and realizes the great gravity of what is being closed off to her and her husband forever. She's now aware of her nakedness and she covers her body in shame. And the really interesting thing about this is, look at the way that Michelangelo has portrayed the bodies of Adam and Eve prior to temptation on the left-hand side. Look at those perfect bodies, and then look at the bodies on the right-hand side. The bodies of Adam and Eve are already showing the ravages of sin. Adam's face is wrinkled and showing the signs of worry and aging. Eve's face has lost its innocence and beauty. Beauty has been replaced by worry and anxiety. So I think that Luther would have appreciated the way in which Michelangelo has shown the wages of sin on Adam and Eve as they are driven from the Garden of Eden into a life of hardship and toil. But let's take a look at what he says about this. This is a rather long passage, but it really gets at Luther's sense of loss right here. All right, in the preceding chapter, we heard how man was created on the sixth day according to the image and likeness of God, so that his will was good and sound. Moreover, his reason or intellect was sound, so that whatever God wanted or said, man also wanted, believed, and understood the same thing. The knowledge of all the other creatures necessarily followed this knowledge, for where the knowledge of God is perfect, there was also the knowledge of the other things that are under God is necessarily perfect. But these words show how horrible the fall of Adam and Eve was, for through it we have lost a most beautifully enlightened reason and a will in agreement with the word and will of God. We have also lost the glory of our bodies, so that now it is a matter of the utmost disgrace to be seen naked. Whereas at that time it was something most beautiful and the unique prerogative of the human race over all the other animals. The most serious loss consists in this, that not only were those benefits lost, but man's will turned away from God. As a result, man wants and does none of the things God wants and commands. Likewise, we have no knowledge about what God is, what grace is, what righteousness is, and finally, what sin is itself. These are really terrible faults, and those who do not realize and see them are blinder than a mole. So there it is, right? It's horrible, and again, in his mind, this is the worst catastrophe that has happened to mankind. And I just want to finish up with this quote right here. As I said, let us not minimize this evil which human nature has contracted as a result of the sin of our first parents. Rather, let us emphasize it. Then we shall both regret deeply this state of ours and have a profound longing for Christ, our physician, who was sent by the Father to heal those evils which Satan brought upon us through sin and to restore us to the eternal glory which we have lost. All right, any questions over this? I don't want to twist your mind in a direction you don't want to go, but I think it's pretty clear that the way that Michelangelo has depicted this, again, you can see the ravages of sin and the shame and the sense of anxiety and almost oppression that Michelangelo is given to these figures as they're being chased from the Garden of Eden. And I think then that it resonates really well with Luther's own perception of the consequences of the fall. Okay, any questions? Yes, please.
The Bible was primarily read in Latin at that time?
Luther's just about getting ready to translate it into German, but for the most part, it's in Latin.
For Michelangelo,
Yep.
during his time.
He could read it. Michelangelo, as a matter of fact, Michelangelo, we know that Michelangelo studied these biblical texts as he was working on these frescoes. Yeah.
That's what I was wondering, if you had any guide or priest, or,
Yes.
because the priest didn't know much about the details of the Bible.
Well, you know, Harry, you're right that there's a whole host of priests out there, particularly on the lower levels, who were very poorly educated. That didn't really matter for what they were expected to do, which is to say the Mass in Latin. They could memorize that, and they could get through that, and they could get through the different rituals they had to do. But at the papal court, they're highly educated, right? And he's working at the papal court, and it's most scholars who write on this argue that Michelangelo had some sort of a theological guide or someone who worked with him as he was conceptualizing how to do this sort of stuff. Yeah, the idea that he's going to be given a free rein to just put up on the papal ceiling whatever he wants that's fantasy. That's not going to happen. So and we'll get into that a little bit more. There's some really, really interesting theological undertones to some of these paintings here that we'll talk about today. Okay, any other questions? That's a good question, yeah. Yes, please.
The figure that's wrapped around the tree, can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, we talked about that last week.
I missed it.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
I don't remember, I was here.
Oh, okay. It's a female serpent. It's a female serpent, and historians of art and people who work on this sort of stuff have traced this back, and actually it's a common portrayal of by this time of giving the serpent, the tempter, the face of a female.
Okay.
And it's traced back actually to around, let me pick this up now, I'm thinking around the 12th century or something like that. There was a misreading of a text which misread the Latin, and I don't have the Latin with me, but the fellow who was commenting on that text misread it to understand the face of a virgin. And the logic of that, it seemed logical, first of all, because serpents can't talk. And how was it then that the serpent was able to tempt Eve? And the idea was that the devil actually gave the serpent the face of a virgin, so it had a mouth. And then secondly, the thought was, well, this makes a perfectly good sense as well, because if this serpent came slithering along with this forked tongue and started speaking to Eve, it was going to frighten her. So and trying to trick her, give the serpent the face of a virgin. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. And this is, you can find this portrayal of female serpents in a lot of art at the time. This is not unusual. Yeah. And so consequently, my sense is that this would not have shocked Luther to see that. As a matter of fact, I used an image from, I think, Wittenberg, as a matter of fact, that shows a female serpent by Lucas Cranach, I think I showed last week. It would not have shocked Luther, but I don't think he would have approved of it because it wasn't in the Bible. Okay, any other questions? It's an interesting figure. Yeah, I was at a cocktail party last night and we started talking about this figure, as a matter of fact. It's interesting. And you can go to Sistine Chapel for years and years and years on end, and your eyes won't really register what you're seeing right there. But it's unmistakable that she's female. Not only does she have a female face, but if you look, you can see her left breast. Right. Yeah. But I've read lots and lots of treatments of this that never even mention the fact that she's female. But it's just jaw-dropping when you look at it. Okay, so I think, yes, Luther would have, as a matter of fact, approved of this treatment right here, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. All right, so this brings us then, we're down through creation. We've covered these first 6 panels right here, and what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to the final 3 panels that deal with Noah. The final 3 panels, they deal with Noah. God's destruction of mankind by a mass flood and the salvation of Noah and his family in the ark. Genesis tells us that after the flood, Noah, upon exiting the ark, immediately built an altar and made an offering to God. Genesis also records that Noah, after the first harvest of grapes in the fall after the flood, proceeded to get skunk drunk on wine. You can't blame him, really. I mean, he's been through an awful lot. So drunk, in fact, that he somehow lost all of his clothing. His youngest son, Ham, stumbled upon his drunk father and mocked him for being drunk. Michelangelo has depicted these events in 3 frescoes. However, he has not followed the order in which they appear in Genesis. Instead, he has depicted the sacrifice of Noah first preceding the flood. And if you remember, I just told you that the Genesis story tells us about Noah building the ark, the flood, and then when Noah comes out of the ark, he thanks God for having spared him and his family by offering a sacrifice. And then finally he goes out and he gets drunk. Well, this is not the order in which Michelangelo presents this on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. What we get, first of all, in this fresco, this 3rd fresco from the end right here, is the sacrifice of Noah. And then that big panel right there is the one that Michelangelo used to depict the flood and the ark floating upon the flood waters. And then finally over here, this last fresco, we get the drunkenness of Noah. So once again, we have scenes that are out of the order in which they are portrayed on the in the biblical account itself. My sense is that he did this because he wanted a big panel to show the flood, to show the ark and the flood. I think that this was an artistic decision that he made right here. I think the same reason that he's has the order inverted down here as well, that he wanted a big panel to show God creating the sun and the moon. The second panel is out of order. It should be the 3rd panel, and that 3rd panel should be the second one. But I think he's making an artistic decision here. What do I really want to use those large panels for? And I think this explains why he's inverted this one right here as well. Let's not be too hard on him. I don't know what Luther would have said about that. He'd probably clock. But we have to cut Michelangelo just a little bit of slack here for artistic reasons. All right, so let's start with the depiction of the sacrifice of Noah. Here's the text that Michelangelo is working from. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. Again, this is after he's come out of the ark. And again, this is out of order, but we'll go with it. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. In other words, original sin is there, it's not going away, and God says, all right, I'm not going to hold that against mankind. Neither will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. That is a rainbow, right? A rainbow. I will set this is my covenant with you. Every time you see a rainbow, you realize that I have vowed that I will never destroy earth again with flood waters. All right. Michelangelo, and here is how Michelangelo has depicted this. Right, here's the sacrifice of Noah. Okay, this is the sacrifice of Noah. You can see Noah's in the background, his finger pointing up like this. He's surrounded by 2 women. The one on his right is his wife. The one on his left is one of his one of his daughter-in-laws, and then these figures in the front as well, a part of Noah's family. Michelangelo, in depicting this, has broken radically with the customary way in which this scene was depicted. Whether he was motivated to do this for artistic reasons or for theological and doctrinal reasons, I'm not sure, but I will lay out for you both possibilities, and you can decide what is motivating Michelangelo here. Now, artists and theologians usually emphasize the covenant that God made with mankind, having been pleased by Noah's sacrifice of thanksgiving. And let me give you an illustration of the typical way in which this was being done. Right? This is how normally this scene would be done. In this treatment, the rainbow, you see the rainbow right there, right? The rainbow figures prominently in the depiction of this particular event. The stress here is on God's grace and mercy. Okay, this is how typically this is done. The sacrifice, you can see the altar right there, and you can see it's a lamb that's been sacrificed on the altar, and you can see Noah here in the front, and then all of his family, and then there's God up there, and God is accepting the sacrifice. and he's pleased with the sacrifice, and therefore he puts the rainbow in there. So this is the way that this is typically done. Michelangelo, if we go back, Michelangelo has instead depicted Noah still in the act of sacrificing. Noah stands over the altar surrounded by his wife and a daughter-in-law. Several of the animals that have yet to be sacrificed are hovering about, and one ram with its throat cut can be seen in the foreground. You see this ram over here, and his throat right there has been cut, okay? Being prepared to be sacrificed up on the altar. Other members of Noah's family are busy helping with the sacrifice, and one figure hands some sort of animal to another to be sacrificed. You see this figure right here in the front bending down, and we suspect that that's probably some sort of a bird, some sort of a fowl that has been prepared to be sacrificed. Another figure wrestles with a ram. This is over here on the left-hand side. You can see this figure over here striding on top of a ram, wrestling with it, preparing probably to slit its throat as well. Another figure off to the right is bringing a load of wood to the altar to be used to stoke the fire, and still yet another figure crouches down and peers into the burning fire underneath the altar. So there's a lot of action going on right here, and it's quite clear that we are in the process of still sacrificing. Michelangelo seems to be focusing upon the text in Genesis that reads, "And the Lord smelled the pleasing odor." Now let's go back and take a look at that text right there. Okay, yeah, and the Lord smelled the pleasing odor. You see that right there? So that this seems to be the text that Michelangelo is using here as the basis for what he's depicting. And Noah, you see what Noah's doing. Noah's gesturing up like this with his hand as if to remind us that a savory odor was arising from the burning flesh upon the altar. Michelangelo may have decided to focus upon this verse to portray in this fresco simply because he did not have the room to give the customary treatment of Noah, the altar, the rainbow in the sky, and God. And let's go back and take a look at this. You see what he's done right here? This is a small panel. You see that panel right there, the third one from the right? It's a small panel. He may simply not have had enough room to put the rainbow up there and to put God up in the sky. If he tried to cram all of this stuff in there, those figures would have been so small you couldn't have seen them from the ground. So maybe the reason that he's focusing on this, that is the act of sacrificing, is he simply didn't have the canvas enough room to give the traditional portrayal. Implied here, of course, would have been the knowledge that Noah's actions and the savory odor would please God and lead to his covenant with mankind. Okay, so that's the artistic expression of why perhaps he chose to break with a traditional portrayal. Any questions? Yeah, Eric.
Why is Noah and his wife and mother clothed and the dude in carrying the wood, but the ones in the front, is that like a status thing or symbolic or something?
No. That's a really good question. I think that what's really going on right here, Michelangelo, there's a lot of argument about this. Michelangelo may have been wandering around Rome and looking at old sculptures and sarcophagi and things like this, and what he's done is he's picked up these nudes from classical images of sacrifices, right? With people in the nude, actually classical portrayal of what's going on. So we may have classical figures there with Noah and his wife and his daughter-in-law. They obviously are clearly members of the patriarchal family, and they have to be clothed because remember, after the fall, there's shame about being naked. Yeah. That's the best argument that people can come up with for that. Yeah, it hasn't escaped other people's attention as well. Any other questions here?
Ron, a math question.
Yeah.
You just got off the ark.
Yeah.
There's not that many animals.
Oh, actually, this is really interesting because what it says is that if you read the fine print, it says that God ordered Noah to take in 7 of every clean animal, right? For the unclean animals, like pigs and things like this, you only have to bring in 2. But if you read the fine print, it says, I want you to bring in 7 of every clean kind of animal. And the argument is that God did this because he knew that when Noah came off the ark that he would sacrifice. And so this is going to take a long time because he's sacrificing from every clean animal that's out there. Right? So this could go on forever and ever and ever.
What's a clean animal?
What's a clean animal? This is according to dietary restrictions, like it would have to be animals without cloven hoofs and things like this that they could eat. Certain fish that don't, fish that have scales they can eat, but fish that are in shells they can't eat, things like that. It's dietary restrictions that they're talking about. Okay, so that is the artistic explanation for this. On the other hand, the theological and doctrinal motivation behind this treatment might be even a little bit more convincing. More literally minded biblical scholars, biblical commentators, and this starts during the Middle Ages and comes up to this period now that we're looking at the Renaissance, argued that in this text, that is that text that I read for you that Michelangelo is working from to get his ideas of how to handle this, that in this text we have, for the first time in the Old Testament, the explicit mentioning of an altar being built upon which a sacrifice to God would be offered. If we go back and take a look at this, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This is the first time in the Old Testament that we have explicit mention of an altar being built to God. There have been sacrifices before, but no mention of an altar. So this is significant for reasons that I will try to tease out for you in just a second. All right, biblical commentators also noted that this text demonstrated that long before Moses laid out the specific rituals and rules for sacrificing to God in the book of Leviticus, the Hebrews had been making sacrifices, right? So, because Leviticus, whoever the author of Leviticus was, and they believed it was Moses at this time, Leviticus is full of all kinds of guidelines and rituals and stipulations for how the Hebrews are supposed to carry out their sacrifices. But biblical scholars are pointing out that long before Moses came along and wrote that, based upon this text right here, that the Hebrews were in fact making sacrifices to God. This line of thought, emphasizing that long before Moses these Hebrews were making sacrifices, emphasized the role of Noah as a priest and as one of the earliest patriarchs to engage in sacrificing to God. It may well be that Michelangelo, led by the theologian from the papal court who was advising him, wanted to emphasize Noah as a priest in this scene. The scene is highly ritualistic. The ram's throat has been ritualistically cut so that the blood could be properly drained from its body. The body of a ritualistically prepared animal is being passed from one figure to another in front of the altar. And Noah, as head of the family, is in charge of carrying out the sacrifices to God on the altar that he built, on the first altar ever built to honor him. What we have then, if we understand this from a theological and doctrinal perspective, what we have here is a fresco demonstrating the doctrinal belief of the church that the role of the priest was essential in helping mankind gain forgiveness of sins. Right? This would have been true for the Hebrews in the Old Testament under the Old Covenant. This would have been true for the Christians living in a pre-Reformation Europe prior to Luther's challenge to the church's position on salvation through faith and works. Let me unpack this, right? Let's go back to that right here. Okay, God is pleased. Noah acting as a priest goes out and he offers up a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of thanksgiving to God. And God is pleased by that odor. He's pleased by what Noah has done. And God says then, because of this, he says, I will never again use a flood to destroy the earth. And I will never again cut off all flesh by the waters of a flood. Right? In other words, because of this sacrifice and because of what this priest has done, God has forgiven their sins, and God says, I will not punish you. Right? This is the theological and doctrinal point that's being made right here, and it is being made through Noah, who is a priest. And so what may be behind this emphasis here on the action that we're seeing, and that is the sacrificing, is a reinforcement of the idea that without a priest you cannot gain salvation. Right? Okay. I'll leave it to you to decide which one of those explanations you like better, the artistic one or the doctrinal and theological one. The other thing that I find really convincing about this doctrinal and theological interpretation of this is that the priest in the Catholic Church was offering up the Eucharist, that is the Mass, and it was a reenactment of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. This is what the Mass is, right? When the priest elevates the host and says, hoc est corpus meum, right? This is my body. Literally, it turns into the body of Christ. Now, the interesting thing here is, if we take a look at where this scene is placed, you see it's this third scene right here. Directly adjacent to that is the Old Testament prophet Isaiah. And the Old Testament prophet Isaiah was probably the foremost prophet in the Old Testament who foretold the coming of the Messiah, right? So I'm convinced that what we've got going on here, the decision to focus upon the act of sacrificing right here, rather than the rainbow in the sky and God's covenant with man, is that what we have here is a reaffirmation of the role of the Catholic priest in salvation in the Church itself. All right, questions? Wow, okay. You're either dumbfounded or I've convinced you, I don't know.
Throwing out there that it's going to happen from the beginning. How did they, I don't think you mentioned it in the first class, how did they ever choose Michelangelo? Why him?
Oh, wow. Yeah. By the time that he does this, what he's painting this in, begins in 1508 and he's going to go to 1512. He has a pretty good body of work underneath it by this point. He's well known, and particularly well known to the Pope who commissions this as Julius II. They have been sort of locking heads on and off for a number of years. So Michelangelo, although he hasn't made a name for himself in painting up to this point, he's a sculptor primarily. But Julius II wanted him to paint his ceiling simply because he was probably the most outstanding. Raphael's working in Rome at the same time, but I don't think that he's already busy down a couple of hallways, already busy painting the papal library and other chambers. And I think that one of the reasons he goes for Michelangelo right here is that Michelangelo had just a tremendous reputation as an artist.
It's primarily artist. It has nothing to do with the biblical knowledge or scholar, or is it?
Well, a number of the works that he has done already, for instance, the earliest work that, probably the earliest or the second earliest work that he does is this wonderful Pietà. You've probably seen it, right? Michelangelo's Pietà with the Virgin Mary sitting down and then Christ, this rather elongated Christ, sort of splayed across her lap right there. That already convinced a number of people that he's probably one of the best artists out there working. He does that, I think, when he's like 23 years old or something like that, right? So he's got a tremendous body of religious works already behind him. Yeah. So he could be trusted to do something like this.
Mundane question. For the visitor coming in, how visible are these figures?
Not
I
very.
mean, they're way up on the ceiling.
The ones I talked about this. I talked about this the first day that I introduced the Sistine Chapel, and that is Michelangelo starts painting down on this end, and he works down towards this end, and he gets down about the fourth fresco down here, and he pulls down all the scaffold, and he looks up and he says, "My God, you can hardly see anything there." And what he does is then, from here on down, his figures get much bigger. And the panels are less crowded because he realizes these things are just too hard to see. So if you start looking down here, particularly down here, these are really, I think, much easier to see than the ones down here. So if you go, what you should do is take some binoculars with you. Okay? Yeah. Or just simply stay at home and look them up on the internet. Absolutely. Yeah. You see, it's really funny because when you go to the Sistine Chapel, you're not supposed to take pictures, right? For whatever reason. And you'll see people trying to sneak pictures all the time, and it's really not worth it because you can't see anything, you know? Yeah. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah, look.
Where is the emphasis on sacrifice?
Where's the emphasis on in this fresco?
Well, or where did that come about, that whole idea of sacrificing?
Oh, yeah, okay. So the Old Covenant, what's happening right here? This is called the Noah covenant, or the Noahic covenant, where God says, because of your sacrifice, right? This is a sacrifice of thanksgiving. My heart is softened, and I will not punish mankind again. And sacrifice, then we can trace the earliest sacrifices go all the way back to Cain and Abel, right? Where they are offering up their first fruits. Abel is grows crops. And Cain goes out, and Cain is, he's a hunter, and maybe I'm getting it backwards, I forget. But anyway, Abel's sacrifice is acceptable to God, but Cain's isn't, and then Cain kills Abel because of that. So all the way back, the idea that you need to placate this God and make offerings to him is embedded within the core of the Hebrew religion. Yeah, and you can, there are different kinds of offerings. One can be like this one, it's an offering of thanksgiving, but you can also offer up a thanksgiving of atonement for sins, right? So it's woven into into the Jewish religion. It goes all the way back to Cain and Abel. Okay, so what is Luther going to say about this? Luther's response to Michelangelo's depiction of the sacrifice of Noah. Luther, I think, would have approved of Michelangelo's portrayal of Noah as a priest. Let's get back to, there we go. Michelangelo's portrayal of Noah as a priest, for he believed that Noah was both a priest as well as a prophet. Luther stressed that Noah made this sacrifice out of gratitude to God for having spared him and his family from the flood. Luther also notes that this text provides evidence that long before Moses laid out the rituals and procedures that accompany Hebrew rituals in the book of Leviticus, the Hebrews were offering sacrifices to God. So Luther is sort of mainstream here in echoing what other commentators have said about Noah and his sacrifice. However, Luther in his commentary focuses not so much on Noah, but rather upon God and the change that has come over God after the flood. Luther emphasizes that God was pleased by the pleasant odor of the sacrifice that Noah offered up. God was so pleased, Luther noted, that his wrath and anger abated. God was so pleased, Luther argued, that he vowed never again to destroy mankind with a flood. As a sign of this covenant, God placed his rainbow in the sky. And Luther spends pages and pages talking about this rainbow and what it meant. And I think Luther very much would have liked to have seen that rainbow up in the sky, making explicit God's mercy and forgiveness to mankind. Unlike Michelangelo, who seems to fix upon the role of Noah as a priest, Luther's focus is upon God, upon his mercy and his grace. So while he probably would have accepted this, I don't think that's what he would have really wanted to see up there. He would have wanted to see that rainbow in the sky. All right, I think then that Luther would have had trouble with Michelangelo's treatment of the sacrifice of Noah. For Luther, the crucial point was God's mercy, forgiveness, and grace that came out of this sacrifice. For Michelangelo and his handlers, the emphasis was upon the role of the priest in the sacrifice itself, which in turn led to God's mercy and forgiveness and grace. For Luther, this would not have been a subtle difference. It would have made a huge amount of difference to him. There's another element that Luther would have had trouble with in this fresco as well. Michelangelo has portrayed 8 people involved in this sacrifice, and indeed, Scripture tells us that 8 people entered the ark and were saved. And as a matter of fact, if you count right here, there are 8 people, right? You can see there's Noah in the front, and then over here directly to his right are his 3 sons, and then there's Noah's wife directly behind him, and then the 3 daughter-in-laws in the back. Okay, those are the 8 people. So we've got Noah and his wife, we've got Noah's 3 sons, and then Noah's 3 wives. And if you do the math, that's 8 people. All right. Michelangelo, if we go back to this, Michelangelo has also portrayed 8 people involved within this sacrifice. Scripture, however, is very specific in who these 8 people were. Noah and his wife, Noah's 3 sons, and their 3 wives. Based on Scripture, what we should be looking at here are 4 males and 4 females. Michelangelo, however, has deviated from this. There are clearly 2 females surrounding Noah, right? You can see the daughter-in-law over here on the left and his wife over here on the right. And if we are very generous, and I say very, very generous, we can also perhaps take this figure right here who's handing that ritualistically prepared animal to this figure over here. She or he, she may be a she, right? So at the most, we have 3 females being portrayed right here. Okay, so this leaves us with 5 males and 3 females in this painting. Luther, being a stickler for an historical, literal interpretation of the text, would have objected to this botched portrayal of the sacrifice of No, it's not biblical, right? It's just not biblical. All right, any question, and don't ask me. Again, I think, was it you, Eric, who asked me about the figures? I forget, yeah, that our best understanding for why he did this was he was out looking at classical sculpture, and he came upon some portrayal of sacrifice on either a sarcophagus or something like this, and liked what he saw, and so he transposes that here in the front. That's our only explanation, but he doesn't follow the biblical text in this. All right. Moving right on. We're going to talk about the flood. Okay, the flood in Noah's Ark. Here's a biblical text that Michelangelo was working from. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and windows of the heaven were opened. The flood continued forth days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bore upon the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily upon the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And all the flesh died and moved upon the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm upon the earth. And every man, everything on the dry land, in whose nostrils was a breath of life, died. He blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. Here's Michelangelo's treatment of this. This is it's pretty stark in its treatment and the reality with which he depicts this catastrophe of the flood itself. Luther, in talking about the flood, says that God destroyed the first world because of the pride of men. That pride led to sins of the flesh. Men, because of their pride, held God in contempt, Luther argued. Luther also has much to say about the evil of the people he calls the Cainites. These would be descendants of Cain, who killed his brother. They tended to introduce and be addicted to sin, and he would, that is Luther, approve of their destruction. Eventually, Luther argues, even the good sons of Adam and Eve, and that would be Seth, right? So there's Cain and there's Abel, and Cain kills Abel, and then they have another son named Seth. Seth continues the good side, the good generation of Adam and Eve, but eventually even the sons of Seth fall into sin as well. So Luther then argues, because of this, that God was rightful in destroying mankind. And I believe he would have approved of the terrifying scenes that Michelangelo painted of dozens of frightened people attempting to flee the rising waters. And you see them huddled over here in this cave-like dwelling, and then trying to reach high land right here. And we have women and children, we have young and old, we have a mother huddling here with her child down there, and then back there on the ark we have people trying to get into the ark at the same time. And listen to what Luther has to say. Luther would have approved of these terrifying scenes, and he writes, just as the ancient world was the most corrupt, so it was also subject to horrible punishment. Not only did the adults perish who had provoked God by their evil deeds, but even that innocent age which has no knowledge whatever and cannot tell right from wrong. And I think what he's doing here is he's pretty much describing what Michelangelo has depicted right here, and that is this horrific destruction of all of life. It's interesting, Luther draws a parallel between the sinful world at the time of Noah and the sinful world of his own day. God, he says, is awakening to the sins of the Pope and the Church and is moving to punish them. Luther would have taken grim satisfaction then to see the terrifying faces of those folks being drowned on the rising waters of the great flood, because he believed that a similar destruction was in store for the Pope and the corrupt clergy. This is a bit of irony if you stop and think about it, because what Luther would see as he's looking up there is what's in store for the Pope in Rome and the clergy, and that is the destruction that Michelangelo has depicted there on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So I think he would, as horrific as this is, I think he would probably approve of this. Any questions about this? Okay. All right, it's 5 minutes after. I want to spend some time talking about that ark up there, but I don't want to get into it today because we're not going to have enough time. So we're going to meet again next week, and we will finish up. We've got to talk about Noah's Ark, and then I'm going to talk about the final fresco, that is the drunkenness of Noah, and then we'll talk about the ancestors of Jesus. All right? Yes, please.
One quick one, Ron, maybe just, is there any record of, like, Michelangelo painted this, did anybody help him? Like, were there laborers that worked along? Do you have any
Right,
kind of
yeah.
interesting?
Yeah, there was first of all, one of the things you need to know about Michelangelo is that he was really, really hard to work with. He's I don't know, probably because of his brains or something like this, he had a hard time tolerating anything less than perfection, and he was very, very demanding, and he had a hard time keeping assistants. But we know that the names of the men who came, they came from Florence, right, where he was from. They came from Florence and they worked for him. A couple of them worked for him for about 2 months and couldn't take it any longer and left, and then he hired some other people to help him as well. But the bulk of this stuff has been done by Michelangelo. Yeah. But he had, kind of a small crew helping him to do this.
Great paints.
Exactly, yeah, go get me a sandwich or something like that. Okay, I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Ron?
Thank you, Ron.
Nice job this time. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, they were through.
Yes.
It's taking a lot longer than 4 years.
It is like
How are you?
This right here will connect you to the old church up there. And if this is an HDMI connection, that's probably the same thing that your television has and stuff like that. And your laptops, you all will have to just plug this right into the laptop. And then when you this is the thing.
Running up the stairs.
Should I bring these cookies back up?
I'll take care of it. I'll take care of
So this came up in a cocktail cart.
it. Well, it's on the bottom shelf. This is a Christmas.
Let's let it slide.
Yeah, can't escape.
Tourists throw tourists
Now, here's the other thing that you have to do. And that is, once this goes, you have to search it. This is right here. And that works regardless of what time.
And
having to get the meeting that is physical.
Yeah, you hit the source, and see it's not there. So you just scroll down like this, and then you get there, you get this one right here.
See, I don't know, just do that.
So we'll just leave this right here.
I think modern.
this, and you see this all right here, I will put this back in the little cupboard over there, and if you need it, all you have to do is just grab it.
Okay, so you're thinking that the converter
Yeah.
is just,
The converter.
assuming he has.
Yeah, the HDMI, because that's what most of you have.
You may have, I made you a copy. You may have seen this one, but this is
The
a
main thing
Christmas
is,
card.
this is the thing that goes to the.
I wanted to pass it on to you.
Okay, so this one, where you have to set the plug in, before
I've
I've been talking to my daughter, because
And that microphone, he needs to go.
Okay, come back here.
I've been alone.
Yeah.
And to send out Christmas cards to people who are associated, I've been kind of struggling with what to say.
We're going to make that session a couple weeks ago here about what to do. When the book was talking about avoiding stress and feel like something you can't do, don't do it.
Oh.
And I just thought she gave us some pointers there.
And
When you're dealing with loss, especially in therapy.
Yeah.
So take care of yourself. That's the best gift you can give to your kids.
and make that.
Thank you.
Okay.
The one that's on the podium right here, will on and off. That's in So this is, if for some reason you come and still think shut down, if there's no lights, make sure you can, yeah.
No.
Yeah, so this is.
Okay, so you need to turn that off.
Yeah.
Okay.
So make sure that you put
Yeah,
that out.
so two things I have to turn on. All right, thank you. All right, I think I can manage.
Hello, Sonia.
Hi there, how are you?
All right, how are you doing?
Okay, I have to get the other cookies. Normal way.
Don, is that the veterans thing?
Pardon me?
That's the veterans?
Yes. So I'll leave it with you.
Okay.
I've been, you're a little younger generation, but I've been passing around to different veterans.
Okay, all right.
And they thought, everyone I've seen do it, they thought it was a great story.
Okay, all right. I'll get it back to you next Sunday.
All right.
All right, thanks.
Wrong one?
Oh, thanks. I've had my share. So how have you been?
Okay. All right. Not wonderful, but okay. And you?
I've been fine.
Okay. You staying around for Christmas?
Pardon me?
You staying around for Christmas?
Oh, yeah, I think I am. Yeah.
Family coming?
My son and his family all be here, but I'm not gonna try and go out to Massachusetts to see my daughter at Christmas.
Where does she live in Massachusetts?
Near Boston, Framingham, about 30 miles
Wow.
east of Boston, west of Boston.
What does she do out there?
She's a nurse practitioner, and she's got 4 children.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Well, you file those somewhere? No,
We hired cookies.
We have paper.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I'm about to get some more.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's about 100.